The United States created its own enemy. Iran wasn't always against America. They were allies. So what changed? And who's really to blame? And it didn't start with war. Iran wasn't always the enemy you think it is. For years, it was one of America's closest allies in the Middle East. Oil flowed, influence expanded, and everything looked perfectly under control. At least, that's how it was presented. Because behind that stability was something far less convenient. Iran was changing. And more importantly, it was starting to act on its own interests. Not everyone welcomed that. Because when a strategic country stops following the script, it stops being predictable. And unpredictability is something powerful nations rarely tolerate for long. And right at the center of that change was one man. His name was Mossadegh. Not a king, not a general, and not someone easy to control. He was elected, already an exception in a region built on power, not choice. But what made him a problem was what he chose to challenge. Iran's oil wasn't truly Iran's. Foreign companies controlled it, took the profits, and left the country with a fraction of its own wealth. Mossadegh moved to take it back. He nationalized the oil industry, cutting out Western interests. A decision that looked legal, even justified. But power isn't measured on paper. This wasn't just about resources. It was about control, and who keeps it. And once that control was threatened, the response was already being prepared. For the United States, this changed everything. Mossadegh's decision wasn't seen as reform, it was seen as a threat. Not just to business, but to influence in a region that mattered too much to lose. And there was another fear. If Iran could take control of its own resources, others might follow. In the middle of the Cold War, that risk felt even bigger. Because losing control didn't just mean losing oil, it meant opening the door to something far worse. So instead of waiting to see what would happen next, a different plan was set in motion. In Washington, waiting was no longer an option. Officially, this wasn't called intervention. Unofficially, everything was already in place. The CIA launched a plan to remove Mossadegh, not through open force, but through pressure, money, and controlled chaos. Protests began to spread. Information was twisted. Loyal figures were pushed forward. The situation escalated quickly. And at some point, it stopped being about right or wrong. It became about who would hold power. And very soon, Mossadegh lost it. Power didn't stay vacant for long. The Shah returned, not as a symbolic ruler, but as the center of authority. This time, his position was secured differently. Backed from the outside, reinforced from within, his rule became far more rigid. Decisions were no longer questioned. Modernization moved fast. Cities changed. Standards of living improved for some. But control came at a cost. Surveillance expanded. Opposition faded from view. And beneath the surface of progress, pressure was quietly building. Pressure doesn't stay hidden forever. What was controlled began to slip. Discontent moved from whispers into the streets. Students, workers, religious leaders, groups that rarely stood together now shared the same frustration. The gap between power and people widened. And the more it was suppressed, the stronger it returned. Protests grew larger. Voices became louder. This was no longer isolated unrest. It was something spreading across the country. And once that kind of movement begins, stopping it becomes nearly impossible. And then, the system broke. What had been building for years finally crossed a line. Crowds filled the streets, not in hundreds, in millions. Control was no longer holding. Orders stopped working. The Shah's authority, once absolute, began to collapse in real time. And then came the moment no one could reverse. He left the country, not in victory, not in control. And just like that, everything that had been built around him fell apart. But removing power is one thing. Replacing it is another. Into that vacuum stepped Ayatollah Khomeini. He didn't promise stability. He promised a complete reset. A system built not around monarchy, but around ideology. For many, he became the voice of change. For others, something far less predictable. The rules shifted almost overnight. Alliances were questioned, priorities were rewritten. And the country that had once aligned with the West began moving in a very different direction. And that shift didn't stay political. It became personal. A group of students stormed the US Embassy in Tehran. They weren't just protesting. They were sending a message. Inside the compound were American diplomats, suddenly turned into hostages. The situation escalated instantly. This wasn't negotiation. It was confrontation, broadcast to the world. Images spread fast. And for the United States, this was more than a crisis. It was a direct challenge, one that couldn't be ignored, and it didn't end in a day. The crisis dragged on, not for weeks, but for 444 days. Every day, the situation remained unresolved. Every day, the pressure grew. For the United States, this became a constant humiliation. Attempts to resolve it failed. Options became limited. The world was watching. And the longer it continued, the weaker America appeared. This wasn't just about the hostages anymore. It was about credibility. And once that starts to slip, the consequences go far beyond one crisis. And after that, nothing returned to normal. Diplomatic ties were cut. Communication stopped. What had once been cooperation turned into lasting hostility. Sanctions followed. Restrictions tightened. Each side began to see the other not as a partner, but as a threat. Years passed, but the tension remained. New conflicts appeared. Old grievances stayed unresolved. And over time, this stopped being a single crisis. It became a pattern, one that would define relations for decades. And it all started with one decision, a choice that seemed strategic at the time, measured, calculated. But history doesn't stay on paper, because actions don't end when they're made. They unfold. And sometimes they come back in ways no one expects. What began as an attempt to secure influence ended up reshaping an entire region and turning a former ally into a permanent rival. Not overnight, but step by step. And once that line was crossed, there was no way back.